Hello, hello. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. My name is Ryan Spencer, and I'm the Executive Director of Comal Conservation. And it just means the world to me when I see a full room, so I'm grateful for all of you. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I know it gets dark in November, and so people, November is always kind of a rough month, but and we just got finished with Horse Fest, so the fatigue is real, and I'm just eternally grateful that y'all are here tonight. I want to start by recognizing the members of my board that are here tonight. If you could wave your hands. Thank you so much for being here. I got one of the hardest working boards. Let's give them a round of applause. They are super cool. And man, did I put them to work last month. It was incredible. I also want to thank our volunteers. I want to thank Scott, and I want to thank Leslie and Tim and Jane for being here. Leslie is our cookie connoisseur, bringer of sweets and snacks, and always there at a moment's notice. Tim is our sign-in guy. Jane has brought all of our outreach and merch stuff, so if you feel like making a donation tonight, you can walk away with a cool tote or bandana or sticker or trucker hat, which is a new addition to the merch stack. And Scott is filming this incredible event, and so that's a warning for all of you who are going to ask crazy questions. You're going to be recorded forever and put on our YouTube channel, so just remember that as ask your questions. I also want to mention that, what's that?
You have a YouTube channel?
Oh yeah, Comal Conservation has a YouTube channel. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
I spend a lot of time on YouTube.
Well, yeah, I've come to our channel and check out our stuff. It's really good. I want to mention that this organization started as a grassroots, volunteer-driven nonprofit, and we still are very much that. We're looking for volunteers. If you care deeply about the land, water, and wildlife of Comal County, we need your help. We need your time. And so we're currently looking for new members of the board. So if you're interested in leading this organization, there's an opportunity to serve in that way. We're looking for a graphics person, so if you're handy with a computer and you're interested in potentially doing some flyers and some social media posts and things like that, or if you're really good with websites, we're looking for people who can help us in that regard too. So feel free to get with me after the meeting and we can totally talk about all those cool things. I also want to mention we've got a cool thing happening tomorrow. So I found out about it today, so I wanted to share it with you. New Braunfels is doing a drainage area master plan, which is really cool. That's super neat. And they're having a public meeting to talk about it tomorrow at City Hall at 5:30. So if you live in New Braunfels and you're interested about the watershed and you want to know what the city is planning, it's a great opportunity to make your voice heard. So we like to tell people that you can volunteer, donate, make your voice heard, or explore the wonderful resources of Comal County. So tomorrow is a good opportunity for that. And I just have to say, we have some incredible celebrations from October. We have these gatherings every other month. And in the in-between months, not everybody gets to know what's going on or what's happening. But this last month was really huge for us. We had an incredible event called the Keep It Country Music Jam. How many of y'all went to that? Anybody? It was an amazing event. We had a ton of fun. We listened to Matt Kirk and the Wayfarers and Zach Walter Band. And, we got to celebrate Leslie Collier as our Gen Z Bat Conservation Award winner, and we raised $31,000 for the cause. So, not that bad. I want to thank Eric Davidak and Beverly Davidak and Heather Harrison and Roxana Dean and everyone else. Jane in the back. So many hours, so much planning, so much work. If I didn't call your name and you're here, just know that I love you. Thank you for putting that event together. It was a big deal for our organization, and it was just absolutely wonderful. I also want to mention, we have an office. How incredible is that? For those of you, it's worth applause for an office. So when I got hired, we didn't really have a place to go, and I was working out of my wood shop in the front of my house, and it wasn't air conditioned. And I started in March, and so that was cool. But as we started getting closer to May, it started getting really hard to have Zoom calls on the front porch. So I started coffee shop hopping, and did that for about a year. And I just want to Shout out to McKenna Foundation for really helping us out. They gave us a sweetheart deal, set us up with printing and Wi-Fi and so many other things. And you know, it's kind of neat because all of our events are here. So I'm right here too, and that just makes things super convenient. So anyway, the office is incredible. So before we get started, I composed a few words about the wildlife here in Comal County. Often when we think of the natural systems of Comal County, we think of the systems that impact us as humans. We think of the rivers and the land that supports our tourism economy. We think of the dark, starry skies that make life so peaceful, and the limestone bluffs that define our riparian woodlands and the campgrounds along River Road. However, we share this beautiful part of Texas with an abundance of wildlife for whom these systems are essential for their continued existence. Diversity and abundance of wildlife in this region are an indicator of our success in conservation. Great examples of wildlife conservation in Texas include red drum off the Gulf Coast, white-tailed deer that were nearly fished and hunted to extinction. Long before the founding of Comal Conservation, Bat Conservation International recognized just how incredible the wildlife of Comal County is. And in 1991, they purchased Bracken Cave to protect the largest bat colony in the world. I'm so grateful for their forward thinking and see BCI as an incredible partner. Tonight, we're in for a real treat. Krystie Miner, the Bracken Cave Preserve Project Coordinator, is going to share her knowledge about bats, BCI, and their conservation efforts across the globe. I encourage everybody to consider becoming a member of Comal Conservation. You can join our Comal Conservation Champions for $25 that I will share. I am also a member of BCI and care deeply about what they do. Krystie holds a bachelor's degree in ecology from Boise State University, I believe Broncos, and a master's degree in conservation biology from Texas State University. Krystie began working with Bat Conservation International in January of 2023 as the project coordinator for Bracken Cave Preserve. She coordinates volunteers to lead tours of Bracken Cave and to help with the numerous other research, conservation, education, and citizen science projects. She also aids in other BCI projects as needed, including white nose syndrome surveys and swabbing agave plants for eDNA. Krystie has a background in wildlife research and conservation and has been working with bats since 2014. I'm repeating myself. She has a BS in ecology from Boise State, and MS from Texas State. She resides in San Antonio, Texas, where she is within a half-hour drive to Bracken Cave, and she spends her spare time exploring the hill country with her dog. Does the dog have a name?
Whiskey.
Whiskey. Very cool. Give a round of applause for Krystie Miner.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much to Comal Conservation for having me here tonight. And thank you to all of you in the audience for being here. It's really exciting to see when so many people want to come learn about bats. In the time that I've worked for BCI, I have learned a lot about bats, but I am constantly learning something new. And I find that really exciting, so I hope that I can pass some of that info along and that you will find something interesting and exciting tonight. So I'm going to talk to you all a bit about, I'll start with kind of the basics of bats, Bats 101, some general things, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the bats that we have here in Texas. And then I'll end by talking about some of the threats that bats are facing and what you can do to help. All right, so to start, what is a bat anyway? So bats are mammals. That means they have fur, that means they give birth to live young, and they feed their young with milk from mammary plants. So just like us or any other mammal. Bats come from the scientific order Chiroptera. In Latin, this translates directly to hand, wing. So if you take a look at this bat skeleton here, you can see why. This is the hand of the bat. On a live bat, that would be covered with a skin membrane, which helps it fly. So something really cool about bats is they have a lot of the same bones in their body that you and I have. And that includes their hands. They have the same wrist bone, the same thumb, the same 4 other digits that we have, the same knuckles and everything. Obviously, as you can see here, their finger bones are a bit more elongated relative to body size. And bats are truly the only mammal that can fly. So you might have heard of other mammals like flying squirrels, for example, but those don't really fly, they just glide. So bats are the only mammal capable of true powered flight. So if another really cool thing that bats can do, they can't really move their thumb a lot, but they can move their other 4 digits independently, just like we can. So this makes them really maneuverable in flight. They can kind of turn on a dime. As compared to birds, you know, they can only flap their wing as a whole. So if you're ever outside at a time where it might be the birds are out and the bats are out, dusk or dawn, if you're looking at something flying in the sky and you don't know whether it's a bird or a bat, pay special attention to how it's flying. If it's really maneuverable, you're probably looking at a bat. All right, another really cool thing about bats is, of course, they can echolocate. So this is a special ability that they have that they use to navigate the world around them. So bat echolocation is basically just that they send out a sound pulse, mostly from their throat, just like how I'm talking right now. Some species of bats will emit a sound pulse through their nose, but most of the ones, especially here in the US, comes from their throat. That sound pulse goes out into the atmosphere until it hits something. It hits something and then bounces back towards the bat. Bats have really great hearing, and they can listen to that returning echo and interpret it, and that's how they find their way around. That, of course, happens in milliseconds, and they're doing it over and over again. And these sound pulses, of course, are ultrasonic, so they're at a higher frequency than what we as humans can hear most of the time. All right, I can't give a talk about bats without busting some myths. So we're just gonna go through a few here real quick. A lot of people think that bats are just flying rodents. This is false. They are mammals like rodents. However, they are not rodents. They come from a completely different evolutionary lineage, and they are not at all related to rodents. You've probably heard at some point in your life that bats are blind. This is also completely false. All species of bats can see. They can see in varying levels. A lot of them are adapted to see well in low light levels because that's when they come out. Some bats can see very, very well, and some not so good, but all bats can see at least a little bit. You may have heard that bats carry rabies. They're just flying around, spreading their rabies everywhere. This is not true. Bats are not carriers of rabies, but they can get rabies, just like you can, or your dog can, or really any mammal. So it's actually pretty rare to come across a rabid bat. If a bat does get rabies, they actually pass away from it pretty quickly, so you're very unlikely to come across a bat that is rabid. With that said, I always have to give a disclaimer. If you come across a bat, or any wildlife for that matter, that is not quite where it's supposed to be or not where it's supposed to be at a certain time, just don't touch it. Call a professional to play it safe. All right, and then bats are out to attack you. Hollywood has done an excellent job perpetuating this myth, but bats are really not out to get you. They are either more afraid of you than you are of them, or they really just don't care about you. And I mean that in the best way. They're out every night on a mission to find food, water, habitat, and they just really don't care that they're there. They're gonna leave you alone if you leave them alone. All right, so across the globe, there are 1,484 species of bats. We have 44 of those species in the United States. The largest bat in the world is the golden crowned flying fox that you can see hanging right here. This bat has a wingspan of 6 feet and can weigh up to 3 pounds. This bat lives in the Philippines, and fortunately it eats fruit. This bat is a fig specialist, really likes figs, but it will eat other fruit. As you can see in this photo, I think that's a banana in its mouth. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the smallest bat in the world, which is called the bumblebee bat. So this bat right here, that's a full-grown adult bumblebee bat. You might also hear it referred to as Kitty's hognose bat. It's just two different names for the same bat. This bat lives in Thailand. It has a wingspan of about 2 inches, and it weighs as much as 2 Skittles. I don't actually know how much that is, but the next time you have 2 Skittles in your hand. And this bat eats bugs. All the other bat species are somewhere in between as far as size and shape. And as you might know, bats live in a lot of different places. So they live in caves, of course. They live in man-made structures. This is a bat house with a bunch of bats tucked up in there. Bridges, other man-made structures, houses, for examples, attics, things like that. And they also live in trees. So actually most of the bats, at least in Texas, live in trees. So this red bat that you can see here is one example. They like to tuck themselves up amongst the foliage of the tree. This bat, when it hibernates, actually just drops to the ground and sleeps in the leaf litter, which is really interesting. They blend in very well. Other bats will live in the crevices of trees that other animals have built. They'll take residence in those when they're not being used. Or some of them will tuck themselves up behind a piece of bark. All right, bats also have different diets. Of course, there are 5 main diets that bats have. All right, so first is our insectivores. These are insect-eating bats. 70 to 75% of bat species are insectivores. So this is, of course, really good for us. We would have a lot worse bug problems if it weren't for these bats. And those types of insects that they eat depends on the size of the bat and where they're found, but it can be things as small as gnats and mosquitoes to bigger moths and beetles. All right, we also have carnivorous bats. So this refers to bats that eat other meat besides insects. So one good example of this is the pallid bat down here in the corner. This bat is eating a scorpion. This bat actually kind of specializes in scorpions. They seem to be immune to the venom. Other carnivorous bats will eat things like mice or fish or frogs, even other bats, which I don't like to think about, but it happens. Then we have frugivores, our fruit-eating bats, like this guy up here. Fruit-eating bats typically live in tropical regions where there's fresh fruit all year round. And we also have nectivores, so these are bats that drink nectar. So they'll drink primarily from plants like agave or columnar cacti, things like that. And last but certainly not least are sanguivores. So these are blood-drinking bats or vampire bats. Out of over 1,400 species of bats in the world, only 3 species are vampire bats. They all live in either Mexico, Central, or South America. And 2 of those 3 species of vampire bats will only drink from birds. So that leaves 1 species in the whole world that will drink blood from mammals. And typically that mammal is like cattle or a deer, something like that. All right, so why do we care anyway? Why are bats so important? There's a variety of reasons. One of them being pest control. So like I said, the majority of bats eat insects, and this is very important because not only are there less, mosquitoes, which I think everyone is okay with, less disease being spread around by those mosquitoes, but a lot of bats will eat agricultural pests. This is really important here in Texas. There's a moth called the corn earworm moth that exists in very, very high numbers, and the caterpillars of that moth will decimate crops grown locally, so things like cotton, corn, tomatoes, things like that. And the bats are really, really important for controlling those populations. A couple studies have been done. The most recent said that bats save US farmers over $20 billion every year in reduced pesticides and crop damage. So they're very, very important for us. All right, bats are also important because they are seed dispersers. So they do this in a variety of ways. One way is if they eat a whole fruit, they tend to poop out the seeds as they fly. Those seeds land on the ground, and that gives opportunity for a new fruit tree to grow. Sometimes, depending on the fruit they're eating, they just don't like the seeds, so they'll spit them out as they're eating. And other times, they're just really, really messy eaters, and they'll accidentally be spitting the seeds out. They're especially important as seed dispersers compared to other animals that are seed dispersers because they can fly really, really long distances. And fruit bats in particular are known for flying over areas that have been clear cut, whereas a lot of other animals will avoid those types of open areas. So they're really, really important in this way. Bats are also pollinators. So fruit bats can be pollinators as well. But mainly here we're talking about our nectar drinking bats. So they will, I don't know how well you can see this, but this bat's got his head all the way up in that cactus flower to drink that pollen, and will be covered in pollen, fly to the next flower. They actually pollinate across the globe over 500 species of plants. A lot of these plants are very economically important plants. These are just a few examples. I always like to point out agave, so adults in the room, next time you have margarita, you can think of that. All right, and here, hoping this works, here's a video. This is a Mexican long-nosed bat pollinating some species of agave. So unlike a lot of pollinators like hummingbird, bats don't hover very well. They can only hover for a second or two. So they kind of just crash into the plant, and their fur just gets covered in the pollen, as you can see. All right, bats are also really important because of ecotourism and scientific advancements. So Congress Avenue Bridge is a really great ecotourism example. The city of Austin brings in $11 million a year just from tourists coming to see the bats. So this is just one example. Other places, especially in Texas, but other places as well, have lots of bat viewing opportunities or bat festivals where they kind of have a party to celebrate bats. Bats have also been studied for a variety of reasons. So vampire bats have been studied to aid in developing blood clot medications. And then echolocation from bats has been studied for a lot of things, but some examples are creating navigational aids for the blind and things like military sonar. Okay, so what bats do we have here in Texas? I will start by saying I don't have time to talk about all 32 species, so I'm just gonna cover a couple, but if you're interested in learning about all 32 species, I recommend checking out the TPWD website. They have a list of every single species in Texas. And then from their website and the BCI website, which I'll show later, you can look up individual things about those bats. Here we have a hoary bat. This is North America's biggest bat. They're pretty big, difficult to hold in one hand. They've got this very pretty, colors of their fur, and they eat really big beetles and moths. So they eat insects. That is one of 32 species. So I mentioned that there are 44 species in the United States. We have 32. In typical Texas fashion, we have more than any other state. And 31 are insectivores, so the hoary among others. And then that other one is a nectivore. So that's this long-nosed bat over here who drinks nectar. You can find this bat, not here in the hill country, unfortunately, but more in West Texas, Big Bend area where there's lots of agave for them to drink. All right, and so why are there so many bats here? Well, not only is Texas a big state, but we have a lot of variety as far as habitats. You've probably seen this ecoregions map or some form of it at some point. So as you can see, there are all different types of places for them to roost. There'll be different food in these different regions. There'll be different climates, microclimates in these regions. It just creates a lot of habitat for bats. There are a lot of bats whose range either starts or ends in Texas. And a lot of bats that migrate through Texas as well. So it's just a really good place for a lot of different types of bats. All right, here are just a few more examples of Texas bats. This first one here, this is a tricolored bat. This is the smallest bat in the US. We have these here in the hill country. They're really tiny and cute. Their name comes from their fur. So if you were to pluck one of their hairs, not that you would do that, but they have a black tip at the bottom and then a little bit of white and then this kind of tannish brown at the top. So that's where they get their name. They are insect-eating bats, of course. They eat tiny bugs. They used to be fairly common, but they are going to be listed as endangered pretty much any time now, and I'll get into that reasoning in a little bit. We have silverhair bats here as well. So they get their name, if you pay attention to their kind of the back region there, they kind of have this frosty, silvery tips on their fur, and that's where they get their name. This bat is pretty widespread across Texas, and they tend to hang out by themselves or in very small groups of like 5 or 10, and they live in trees. So they're kind of known for tucking themselves up behind loose pieces of bark. And then we have a spotted bat. So this one is not found here in the hill country. It's found more in West Texas, but I think it's a really cool bat, so I wanted to talk about it. It's got these big ears, as you can see, really great for hearing. This bat is also referred to as the whispering bat, and that's because they have really low frequency echolocation. So to a bat, they're really soft and kind of whispering. If this bat were to fly over your head, you could hear its echolocation, which I think is really cool. So one of the only bat species that dips into the human hearing range. All right, and then we have our most common bat in Texas, the Mexican freetail. So if you have ever seen a bat in Texas, you have probably seen a Mexican freetail. Very, very common. They are the official state flying mammal, which I didn't know was a thing until I started this job. They are the highest and fastest bats. So they can fly at altitudes of up to 10,000 feet. And they've been recorded at flying 98 miles per hour in powered flight. So this allows them to cover really long distances as far as migration, and just in one night, they can fly a 60-mile radius. They like to live in really large colonies. So if you have ever been to or even heard about Bracken Cave, Congress Avenue Bridge, Old Tunnel, Frio Cave, even outside of Texas, Carlsbad Caverns, among many others, those are all Mexican freetail colonies. They like to be amongst large groups. So we call this a medium-sized bat. Their wingspan is about 12 inches, and they weigh about 11 to 15 grams. For reference, if you were to hold 2 quarters in your hand, that's about 11 or 12 grams. So that's roughly how much they weigh in the bat world. We call that medium. And they're called free-tailed bats. So there's actually a whole scientific family of bats called Velocidae that is free-tailed bats. They're called free-tails because, as you can see here, their tail sticks out quite a bit. So in species of bats that are not free-tails, you would see in other bat species or other types of bats that wing membrane would be going all the way up to the tip and continuing. So if you're able to see the bat up close, you can tell pretty easily whether or not you're looking at a free-tailed bat or not. And also lending to their name is they migrate to and from Mexico every year. So these are some examples of their migration routes. So they can fly over 1,000 miles in this journey from spring to fall. And you might also hear these bats called Brazilian free-tailed bats. It is the same species of bats, but there are some bats that live in Mexico. That's their northern range, and then they migrate to Brazil. So if you ever hear that, that's why, but it is scientifically the same species. All right, so one of the places that these bats like to live is Bracken Cave. Raise your hand if you've ever been to Bracken. Okay, yeah, awesome. These maybe like half-ish of the room. If you haven't, hopefully you can get out there next summer. This is Bracken Cave. This cave was purchased by BCI in 1992. At the time, the footprint of the cave was about 5 acres, just to protect the cave from developers. Today, BCI owns over 1,500 acres surrounding the cave. There are 15 to 20 million Mexican retail bats in this cave in the summer. So they migrate up from Mexico to Bracken Cave, starting in February. Usually they're all here by about April. And at that time, we estimate there are 8 to 10 million bats, but they're all pregnant females. So they come up to Bracken to have their babies, and they usually give birth roughly early June, and they have one baby bat, which is called a pup. About 5 weeks later, the pups are flying on their own, and therefore the population essentially doubles, and that's where we get 15 to 20 million bats. This makes it the world's largest bat colony, as well as the largest concentration of males known on Earth. All right, so this is a picture of the inside of Bracken. The cave itself is 650 feet long, about 117 feet from floor to ceiling, and about 120 feet wide at its widest point. When people come to visit in the summer to Bracken to watch a tour, we always get one person that asks, "Why can't you go inside?" There are several reasons for this. One of them is you've got 20 million bats, and they're out eating all night, and they, just like any other animal, have to do what you do after you eat. They have to go to the bathroom. So there's a lot of guano at the cave's floor. There's so much urine and guano that it's a very toxic atmosphere. So there are really high levels of ammonia and CO2, so much so that if you went in as is, you would not make it very far. Also on the floor of the cave, you can't see, of course, but kind of on top of and intermixed with the guano are thousands and thousands, possibly millions of beetles. These beetles will eat the guano. So they'll eat the guano, and after they're done processing, it comes to kind of like a fine powder. And they will also eat the bats. So the bat falls to the ground after it dies. They can clean it to a skeleton in a couple of hours. So usually once we explain those things, people don't want to go in anymore. We as researchers have to go in once or twice a year. We go in when their bats are not there, or at least the pups aren't there, just for collecting samples. So for example, we have temperature loggers that take temperature and humidity and stuff like that. So we keep track of those things. And when we go in, we have to have full respirator gear. So at one point, people started asking, well, how deep is the guano? Which is a great question. And about 10 years ago, we had some folks out to measure the depth of the guano with resistivity equipment, which is kind of using electric pulses to measure the depth. The instrumentation at that time had the capability of measuring down to 75 feet, and it reached 75 feet. Since then, the technology has improved. So we had them out again a handful of years ago, and they were able to measure 100 feet of guano. So there's lots and lots of guano in this cave. All right, so this is a video of Bracken. So for those of you who haven't seen it, in the summer months, May to September, this is one of the views you would have if you were to come to a tour. The bats, depends on the year, but typically they emerge from the cave earlier than other colonies, and that's because there are so many bats. So this emergence will take 3.5 to 4 hours for all the bats to exit. And you don't wait that long, but the bats will still be coming out, and they do this every night. Another really cool thing about being at Bracken is getting to see the predators of the bats. Some people like seeing that, some people don't. But there are lots of hawks. We have red-tailed hawks, Swainson's hawks, peregrines, a couple others, and snakes as well. So coach whip snakes are really common. They will kind of wait at the bottom of the cave to snatch a bat or get one that has fallen to the ground. All right, so those are some bats that we have here in Texas, but here in Texas and elsewhere, bats need our help. There are 85 bat species currently listed as endangered. Several more are in review to be added to this list. There are 13 species that are critically endangered, which essentially means if we don't take drastic action now, they're going to be extinct. And 236 species are considered data deficient, and that just means that we know that they exist, but we don't know enough about them to know if their populations are stable or not. All right, so you might be asking, well, why? What's going on with the bats? There are several factors, one of them, of course, being habitat loss. This is happening on pretty much a global scale. So mainly human-mediated reasons. All these things lead to a loss of food, a loss of foraging habitat or roost sites, places to live. Wind energy is another problem for bats. So there are over 1 million bats that die each year from wind turbines, and most of these fatalities occur during migration seasons. So from research, we've been able to determine that these are migratory bats that are getting killed, like our hoary bat here, and this is a red bat. These species are getting hit a lot harder. The placement of the wind turbines tends to align with the migration patterns of some bat species. We've also come to find out that certain species are actually attracted to the wind turbines, and we don't really know why yet, but some research is being done to find ways to deter bats from coming near them. So the hoary, again, this is one I showed earlier, one of the biggest species in North America, used to be super, super common, and is quickly on its way to being endangered. All right, and then we have white nose syndrome. So white nose syndrome is a disease that has already killed millions of bats in the US. It's caused by a fungus that I'm just gonna call PD. This fungus was brought to the United States, was first detected in New York, upstate New York in about 2006. Likely brought over from Europe by a human who probably went into a cave or somewhere where the fungus was present and wore the same clothing or equipment in a cave in the US. Since then, it has been spread by the bats. So this fungus is a cold-loving fungus. So the fungus needs cold temperatures and humidity to thrive. And unfortunately, those conditions coincide with where bats like to hibernate. So white nose syndrome has been really bad for hibernating bats in the US. So this is a tricolored bat, which I showed earlier. This species is getting hit really hard with white nose. So as you can see, the fungus usually starts on the nose, but it'll go wherever they have skin. So their wings, their ears, and it's just a really bad irritant for the bats. So they get really itchy. Sometimes they will be so itchy that it'll tear holes in their wings or make their wings really fragile, which makes it harder for them to fly. But the main reason that it causes fatalities is because it tends to get really bad in the middle of hibernation, and the bats actually wake up repeatedly during hibernation and end up burning through their fat stores and starving to death. So tricolored bats, little brown bats, cave myotis, northern long-eared bats, those are the species getting hit the hardest by this disease. There is a lot of research going on how we can combat this or make the outcomes less severe. Recently, some good news has been showing that with little brown bats, who are the first ones to really take a big hit, a lot of populations in the east are starting to show some immunity to white nose, so there could be good news on that front. All right, and other things that lead to population declines in bats, harmful myths that lead to persecution and hunting. So, people just thinking that bats are disease-ridden and gonna attack them. Some people think they're bad luck, that sort of thing. Some people do hunt bats for meat, things like that. On top of all these things, bats are really slow to reproduce. So most bats on average have one pup every year. There are some species that will have more than one, but most only have one. And they don't, of course, reproduce their whole lives. Mexican freetails, for example, after their first year, they'll have one pup a year until they're about 8. They can live up to 12 to 15 years. So it's just, in a lot of these cases, it's just not fast enough to replenish their populations as fast as they're declining. All right, so now that we're all depressed about that, what can you do to help? Fortunately, there are things you can do, and these things are all really accessible to most people. So they're really easy things that you can do. One of those things is to plant a bat garden. So as you know, most of the United States, people live in urban or suburban areas. A lot of those areas have lawns. People like the way lawns look, which is great, but they're not very functional for wildlife. So a very simple thing you can do, even if you have a lawn, is just to plant a garden. So in its simplest form, a bat garden is just a native garden. And the point of the garden is to draw in food for the bats to eat and giving them more opportunity to have foraging habitat. If you were interested in creating more bat-specific garden, there are some things you can do. So you want to look for flowers that are really fragrant, flowers that bloom at night, and really light or pale colored flowers, as those will attract more. And then there are specific plants that are known to be really good moth host plants. If you are interested in doing any of this, the BCI website, which I'll show at the end, has a whole page on bat gardens and specific plants that you can plant that fit this criteria. So I definitely recommend checking that out if it's something you're interested in. All right, other things you can do, keep your cats indoors. This is good for bats as well as many other animals like birds. To your cats, a bat is just a nighttime bird. So they actually do kill a lot of bats. So it's best to keep them indoors at all times. Reduce or eliminate your use of pesticides and herbicides whenever possible. And last but not least, turn your lights off at night. This can be a little bit counterintuitive because a lot of people will say, well, hey, I see bats foraging under my porch light or under street lamps. And while this is true, those bats that forage under lights tend to be urban species, generalist species, and a lot of other species are driven away. So it doesn't actually create more food for species that need it. Instead, it drives those species away, concentrates 1 or 2 species in those areas. So overall, better for all the wildlife to turn your lights off at night. And last but not least, educate people. Be excited about bats, talk to people about bats, even if it's just sharing why bats are important, going to see bats somewhere so that people know you don't have to be afraid of them. Another great way to do this is to volunteer. So there are lots of ways you can get involved. For example, Bracken Cave, we have a lot of volunteer activities. We have some volunteers in the audience. And you can do things, if you want to help lead the bat tours, that's something that you can do to volunteer. There's also a lot of more education opportunities, things like giving talks to different groups or at tables and booths for different areas in the area. So get involved if you can, but also just talking to people about bats is extremely helpful. All right, that's all I've got for you today. My contact info was down here. If anyone has follow-up questions or wants to volunteer, please reach out anytime. Batcon.org is Bat Conservation International's website. We have a whole host of information on there. You can find more information about bats, about individual bat species, bat gardens, other ways to get involved in other projects that BCI does as an organization. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Right. If the mother bat dies, what happens to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, most of the time, the pups don't make it if the mama doesn't make it. There are some exceptions. But vampire bats actually are one species that are very helpful outside of their familial relations. But for the most part, something happens to mama bat, the baby bat will also pass away.
I know that you can put bat houses up on your property. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So bat houses can be a really valuable way to help bats. I say can because there are a lot of ways to go wrong with bat houses. So for one thing, I think people tend to think that bat houses attract bats, and they don't. Bats kind of have to stumble across them on their own, and they happen to need a place to live. That said, there are a lot of people who have successful bat houses. If it's something that you're interested in doing, we have specifics on our website as far as placement and stuff, but you just want to be careful to get the right type of bat house. So there are a lot of bat houses out there that are not very good for bats. And unfortunately, they're usually the cheap ones that you buy at Lowe's or Amazon, places like that. The reason why they can be bad is because they're too small most of the time. And a lot of them will come with this sort of like mesh in the back. And I think the idea that people started putting that in is because they thought the bats needed a way to hang on. But if it's made from the right type of wood, they won't need that. And instead, that mesh can rip their toes off, it can get stuck, or sometimes the bats will try to get under it and they'll get trapped and they can't get out. So you just want to make sure it's a safe bat house and that it's big enough for the bats. But they can be valuable, yes.
So I have two questions. Where are all the male bats? And the other is, we always see where they're emerging, but can you also see it when they all come back home?
Yeah, great questions. So first of all, where are all the male bats? So the male bats, depending on the species, Mexican free-tailed bats, some of them stay in Mexico all the time. They don't want to come up here. We do obviously have male bats in the hill country. They form their own colonies. We call them bachelor colonies. And they're usually smaller than the maternity brews. So a lot of, like, if you've been to Camden Street Bridge, downtown San Antonio, you can watch the bats come out from under that bridge. And that's, as far as I know, that's one bachelor colony. So they're just kind of dispersed in smaller groups all around. And then, sorry, what was your second question?
Can you see them all come back?
Oh, yes, coming back. Yeah, so you can. It's definitely, at Bracken, for example, we do have tours, morning tours. Bracken, for those who don't know, is privately owned by BCI, so you can't just walk in. You do have to have a reservation, but we do have morning return flights that you can see as well. It is a completely different experience. So it's really cool. They don't all, kind of circle in the way they circle out. They kind of come back in smaller groups, and they like to kind of drop from really high and nosedive into the cave. So it's a lot different. But in other places, depending on the size of the colony, if they're coming back individually, you might not see them as a whole group, but you definitely can. They usually start before sunrise, usually done before sunrise, so it's definitely possible.
Thank you.
have two questions. One is, what is the swarm fold? And the other is, when they're swarming out, why don't they run into each other?
Great questions. I don't have a technical term for the swarm, but at Bracken we call it the bat NATO. It seems to be pretty well accepted. The real answer to why don't they crash into each other is they do. They absolutely crash into each other. So they're very, very light. So they're able to kind of rebound. But if you were to take a video, which people have done to get at your exact question, and slow it down, they're crashing into each other all the time. They just they're able to recover pretty quickly. Every now and then they'll get knocked to the ground. But yeah, they do run into each other.
So different species of bats don't cohabitate together.
Sometimes they do. They don't at Bracken. We've never had another species of bats at Bracken, and some of that could be because of the toxic atmosphere. But yeah, there are definitely caves that will house multiple species. There have been sightings of bats actually, for lack of a better term, cuddling, or actually roosting together, but it's pretty rare. Typically they stick with their own species.
So why does the toxic atmosphere in the cave not bother the bats?
Yeah, good question. So a couple reasons. So one is that we think that they're somewhat evolved to handle it, but they're heavier gases that stay closer to the floor, and the bats, of course, are way up on the ceiling. So that's why it would be a lot worse for us. We're obviously closer to the floor. So I think a combination of those factors.
No, all right, so I live like 2 miles away from Bracken Cave. Before the high school, Davenport, got on there, we had tons of bats swallowed. Which direction do they leave now?
Yeah, so as far as I know, they're still ultimately heading south towards the agricultural fields. And a lot of times they do fly that way, but they do kind of disperse once they get higher up. So most likely, my best guess would be that they're going around the school because of all the lights. Yeah, unfortunately.
You mentioned that the floor in the Bat Cave is at least 100 feet of water. How long is it going to take to fill up and then there won't be any room left?
We don't really know. Fortunately, the beetles actually kind of help with that because they turn it into kind of a powder. It takes up less room in that powder form. And then we also, the cave has never really like flooded, but when water does get in there, it kind of compacts everything down. So it seems to stay relatively steady. It's definitely possible that it'll fill up, and it's probably going to be a long time if it does happen.
I guess keep thinking on that federal system.
You mentioned the bat NATO. Do they need to take that circle to get elevation, or why do they go up at a tornado?
Yeah, so we think so. We think that's why they do it, partially to get that lift from coming, because they're coming out of the cave, as you saw, kind of low to the ground. So it helps them kind of get lift. But also staying together as a group and kind of circling is, we think, a predator defense as well. They're all kind of trying to stay in the middle to be the one that's not snatched away. So our best guess is that those are the reasons.
You said when the bats are coming back, they're going really fast. Do you have any idea how fast? And do they make that ripping sound? Because when they're going back into the devil's sinkhole at about 1 a.m.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I don't have an answer for how fast they're going, but that would be really interesting to try to figure out how to record that. But it is so fast that I don't know how it is at your sinkhole, but they're diving in, and it's kind of like a streak, they're so fast that they're kind of just a streak, and they do make this ripping sound. I don't know how else to describe it. It's kind of like a buzzing or a ripping sound coming down, flying so fast.
Yeah, I'll speak in a second. Somebody asked about how many years it's going to take to fill up the cave. Cavers, like myself, have been going there I've been going there since the early 70s. And I have pictures taken in the early 70s from inside the cave looking out that look identical to the ones that were taken last year. I mean, you can't see any noticeable difference from the ceiling and some of the same rocks that you're seeing now are the same rocks we were seeing then. So I think it just continues to compact and dissolve down deep. And some of the early resistivity work that they did, they set the 75 feet early on and 100 layers. When I was talking with the people doing that work, part of the problem with figuring out how deep is guano is it gets denser and denser and denser and with water and dense, and pretty soon it's hard to tell where the guano stops and the rock begins because they're pretty much equal. So it's not an exacting science where the transition between the compacted guano and the rock is. So
That rock was the.
That's really interesting.
Do you have any other questions for Krystie? Everybody's wow. Let's give her another round of applause. You did absolutely wonderful. And I have to say, it might just be the fact that it's the end of our community program season for the year, but this has to be my favorite end slide of all time. That's pretty cool. I love the bat and the cowboy hat. We have a little gift for you. We've got our coat and our trucker hat and our bandana and some stickers in there for you. Thank you for coming out. Probably appreciate it. Krystie and the team at Bat Conservation International is absolutely wonderful. They're an incredible group of people, and we're lucky to be able to partner with them. So I'll just add before we go, I know I'm probably going to forget a dozen announcements, but again, tomorrow at 5:30 at City Hall, they're going to be presenting the drainage area master plan, and they're going to ask for public comment. So if that's something that interests you, I encourage you to go. I also want to tell you that you guys put wind in our sails. You put fuel on our fire. We need your time, your talent, your leadership to make this organization really take off. And so I want to encourage you to think about how you can volunteer, how you can get engaged. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can sign up online at comalconservation.org to become a volunteer. And of course, if you make a donation tonight, you can get some really cool merchandise. So any announcements I'm forgetting? Are we feeling pretty good? All right, friends. Well, thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next time.